2 hours before the ship sank, the lookouts couldn't find their binoculars. This small detail determined the fate of 1,500 people. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the greatest disaster in maritime history occurred. But everyone thinks they know. It hit an iceberg, it sank. People lost their lives. Is the truth really that simple? Tonight, we won't tell the well-known story of the Titanic, but its unknown details. We will examine the hidden flaws in the ship's design, the strange decisions made on the last night, and the lives that could have been saved but weren't. It's okay if you fall asleep, but have you ever wondered, why did some passengers never board the ship? If you're ready, let's begin. Everyone knows the Titan, a giant ship, an iceberg, a tragic end. But the surface of this story is just a small part of the ice the ship saw that night. The real story is hidden beneath the water. Tonight, we will dive into those dark waters. First, we will examine the ship's design. Then we will see the preparations for the final voyage. Then we will relive that terrible night moment by moment. And finally, we will discover what happened after the disaster. But where did they start? The story of the Titanic actually began at a shipyard in Belfast at the turn of the century. Harland and Wolff Shipyard was one of the world's most famous shipbuilding centers. Here, the most ambitious project in human history was planned. The White Star Line Company wanted to establish dominance in the Atlantic. Rival companies were breaking speed records, but White Star Line decided on a different strategy. Luxury and comfort instead of speed. The biggest, most magnificent, and safest ship. They planned 3 sister ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. The first, the Olympic, was launched in 1911. The Titanic was the second. The Titanic's design was based on the most advanced technology of its time. The ship was 269 meters long, 28 meters wide, and more than 18 stories high. A giant of 32,000 tons. Let's make a comparison. Of course, it wasn't as large as a modern aircraft carrier, but for that time, it was like a building reaching into the sky. The ship had decks inside. First-class passengers stayed in cabins resembling palaces. There was a swimming pool, a gym, a Turkish bath, a library, luxurious dining rooms, and even a Parisian cafe. The second-class cabins were better than the first-class cabins on other ships. Third-class passengers were immigrant families, and they also enjoyed good conditions for the time. But what was truly interesting was the ship's safety system. The Titanic was designed to be unsinkable. At least, that's what was said. The ship's hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments. These compartments could be separated from each other by automatic doors. The idea was that if the ship was damaged in one place, only that compartment would take on water. The other compartments would remain dry. The ship would continue to float. According to calculations, even if 4 compartments took on water at once, the Titanic would not sink. This system was a marvel of engineering. Newspapers of the time wrote that the ship was one that even God couldn't sink. But there was a problem. These compartments weren't completely sealed. The walls separating the compartments weren't high enough. If one compartment filled up, water could spill into the adjacent compartment, like a domino effect. This detail would play a critical role in the disaster, but that night hadn't arrived yet. Now let's ask a strange question. Was there a deliberate flaw in the Titanic's design? No, but there were cost-cutting decisions. For example, the number of lifeboats on board could accommodate 2,200 people. However, there were only 1,120 lifeboats available. Why? Because more lifeboats would have overcrowded the deck. Also, according to the maritime laws of the time, this number was sufficient. The laws were written based on old technology. The size of ships had increased, but the law hadn't changed. So legally, The Titanic set sail with enough lifeboats, but logically it was insufficient. This was the first hidden mistake. The second detail was the quality of materials. The ship's outer shell was made of steel plates. These plates were joined together with rivets. Rivets were like metal nails. Hundreds of thousands of rivets were used. Modern research has shown that the quality of these rivets varied. Some rivets were made of high-quality iron. Others were made of lower-quality material. Why? Because high-quality material was expensive. The shipyard used cheaper materials in some areas. Lower-quality rivets were more common, especially in the bow of the ship. This area would be the exact spot where it struck the iceberg. This was the second hidden mistake. The third problem was the communication system. The Titanic had a radio system, Marconi's most modern equipment. These devices could exchange messages with other ships and shore stations. However, the radio operators were employees of the Marconi Company, not White Star Line. Priority was given to passenger messages because wealthy passengers wanted to send messages to their families and businesses, which brought in money. Messages concerning the ship's safety were sometimes relegated to secondary importance. This was the third hidden flaw. The design was completed. The ship was built. On May 31st, 1911, the Titanic was launched. Trial voyages began. The tests were successful. The ship operated flawlessly. Speed tests were conducted. Maneuverability was tested. Brakes were tested. Everything was fine. Finally, the date of the first voyage was set, April 10th, 1912, from Southampton to New York. The world's eyes were on this giant ship. But before boarding, strange events began to occur. The first strange event was this. Several passengers canceled at the last minute. They canceled their reservations. They didn't board. Why? Some said they had bad dreams. Some said it was intuition. A businessman canceled without giving any reason. A family didn't go at the last minute, saying they were ill. A coincidence? Perhaps, but some of these cancellations saved lives. Interestingly, the number of people who didn't board the ship was not small at all. The second strange event was the fire. Yes, you heard right. Before the Titanic left Southampton, a fire broke out in the coal bunker. This fire had been burning for several weeks. Coal bunkers could sometimes spontaneously catch fire because the coal heated up when compressed. This heating could cause ignition. The fire on the Titanic started this way. The crew tried to put out the fire. They moved the coal, poured water on it, but they couldn't completely extinguish it. When the voyage began, the fire was still burning. This information was kept secret for years. Why? Because the company didn't want the ship to be delayed. A delay meant a loss of money. Also, the public could panic. That's why they kept quiet about the fire. Modern theories suggest that this fire weakened the ship's steel structure. The area where the fire occurred was exactly near where the iceberg caused damage. Perhaps it was a coincidence, perhaps not. The third strange event was the last-minute crew changes. The ship's second captain was replaced at the last minute. Another experienced captain was brought in to replace him. This change triggered a chain reaction, as each officer filled the position of a junior officer. The lowest-ranking officer was then removed from the ship. This officer's name was David Blair. Blair hastily left the ship, but he forgot something. The key to the binoculars was in his pocket. The binoculars were kept in a special locker for the lookouts to use. Blair forgot to take the locker key. The locker remained locked. The lookouts could not use the binoculars during the voyage. They could only observe with the naked eye. This detail would prove critical. April 10th, 1912, midday. Southampton Harbor was crowded. 2,200 people were ready to board the ship. First-class passengers arrived in luxury cars. Second-class passengers arrived by train. Third-class passengers were mostly immigrant families. They came with the dream of starting a new life in America. They had all their wealth in their suitcases. Boarding began. First-class passengers passed through special entrances. Red carpets were laid out. Officials greeted them politely. Second-class passengers boarded from the middle deck, while third-class passengers boarded from the lower deck. Security checks were strict, even including health checks for immigrants, as entry into America for the sick was prohibited. Among the famous passengers was John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men of the time, traveling with his young wife. Benjamin Guggenheim was another wealthy passenger, having made his fortune in mining and metallurgy. Isidor Straus owned the Macy's department store and was traveling with his wife, Ida. This couple would choose to remain together during the disaster. The ship also carried engineers, architects, writers, and artists. Molly Brown was a philanthropic and powerful woman, later becoming famous as Molly Brown, the unsinkable ship. Around noon, the Titanic left the dock. Whistles blew, crowds waved, and the ship moved slowly. However, within the first few minutes, it nearly caused an accident. The Titanic's massive hull created a huge wave in the water. A smaller ship nearby, the New York, was affected by this wave. Its mooring rope snapping, it began to drift toward the Titanic. A collision was imminent, but Captain Edward Smith of the Titanic maneuvered quickly. He reversed the engines. The collision was averted at the last moment by a matter of meters. This small incident alarmed some. Was it an ominous start? Captain Smith dismissed it. He was experienced. He had worked on ships for 40 years. It was his last voyage before retirement. Everything was under control, or so he thought. The Titanic sailed toward Cherbourg. It would make a stop in France, where more passengers would be taken on board. It arrived in Cherbourg in the evening. However, the port was not suitable for the Titanic's size. The ship anchored offshore. Small boats carried passengers aboard. Among them was a famous woman, Margaret Brown, or Molly Brown. Sir Cosmo D.F. Gordon and his wife, Lady Lucille, also arrived. Lady Lucille, a fashion designer, was a famous figure of the time. At midnight, the Titanic left Cherbourg. The next stop was Queenstown, Ireland. It arrived in Queenstown on the morning of April 11th. Here, the last passengers were taken on board. Most were Irish immigrants, going to America. Among them was a young man named Eugene Dilly, famous for his bagpipes. He played his bagpipes as they boarded the ship. The crowd listened. No one knew that this melody would be the last for some. Around 1:30 p.m., the Titanic left the Irish coast. They were now on the open sea. The next stop was New York. It was approximately 2,000 kilometers away. The journey was estimated to take 4 days. The ship was moving quickly, at around 22 knots, which was equivalent to 40 kilometers per hour. The passengers were comfortable. The weather was fine, the sea calm. First-class passengers were enjoying luxurious meals. Second-class passengers were strolling on deck. Third-class passengers were enjoying themselves in their own areas. Music, dancing, laughter. Everyone was hopeful. Friday, April 12th, the second day of the voyage. Everything was going well. The weather was still fine. The sea calm. However, messages began to arrive in the radio room. Other ships were sending iceberg warnings. There are icebergs in the North Atlantic. Be careful. The first message came from the Coronia. Captain Smith received the message and noted it. However, he did not change the course, because icebergs were normal in that area. Ships always sailed cautiously. Besides, the Titanic was very large. A small iceberg couldn't damage it. At least, that's what he thought. The second warning came from the Baltic. It was more detailed. It reported the location of the icebergs. Captain Smith received this message as well. He showed it to the crew. But again, the course did not change. The third warning came from the American ship. It was even more detailed. We are passing through a large iceberg area. Be careful. This message remained in the radio room because the radio operators were busy. They were relaying passenger messages. Wealthy passengers were sending messages to their business partners in New York. The operators were prioritizing this. In the evening, another warning came from the Mesaba ship. This time it was more serious. You are in a vast iceberg area. There are hundreds of icebergs. Slow down immediately. But this message never reached the bridge. The radio operator was focused on passenger messages. He ignored the warning. Captain Smith remained unaware of this message. Saturday, April 13th, day 3 of the voyage. The weather began to change. The temperature dropped. The sea was still calm, but the air was cold. Passengers began to spend time in front of their cameras. First-class passengers read books in the library. Some exercised in the gym. Some swam in the swimming pool. Second-class passengers listened to the saloon piano. Third-class passengers danced to music on their decks. Everyone was enjoying themselves. But that day, 6 more of these warnings were received. The California ship, the Rappahannock ship, the Nordam ship, they all said the same thing: icebergs. Be careful. Captain Smith saw some of the messages, but not all. Yet the course was not changed, nor was the speed reduced. Why? Because there was competitive pressure. White Star Line wanted to break the record for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic. The ships of rival Cunard Line were faster, but the Titanic was the most luxurious ship. If it was fast, it would be a complete victory. That's why Captain Smith was eager for speed. He was also experienced. He hadn't had a serious accident in 40 years. He was confident. The air grew colder in the evening. The sun set, darkness fell. There was no moon, only stars. The sea was calm and smooth like glass. There was no wind. This was actually dangerous, because when there were no waves, it was difficult to see the icebergs. Normally, waves created foam around the icebergs. This foam was visible from afar, but that night there was no foam, only darkness and silence. At 9 o'clock, Captain Smith left the deck. He ate his dinner. He went to rest. First Officer William Murdoch went to the bridge. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee went up to the watchtower. Their job was to monitor the sea and report dangers. But they had no binoculars because of the key David Blair had forgotten. They relied only on their eyes. The air was so cold that their breath turned to steam. Their hands trembled, but they were careful. They were constantly looking ahead. At 11 p.m., one last warning came. The radio operator from the California sent a message. We are stuck in the ice. We have stopped our engines. Be careful. But this message was answered sharply by the Titanic's radio operator, Jack Phillips. Silence. I'm busy. I'm sending passenger messages. The California's operator was offended. He switched off his radio and went to sleep. This small offense would make a big difference, because a few hours later, when the Titanic sent a distress call, the California would not receive the message. The radio would be off. 11:40 p.m. The Titanic was sailing at 22.5 knots. Lookout Frederick Fleet was looking ahead. Suddenly, he noticed a strange shape in the darkness. It was slowly becoming clearer. An iceberg, a gigantic iceberg. He immediately rang the bell 3 times. This was an emergency distress signal. He picked up the phone and called the bridge. An iceberg right in front of us, he shouted. First Officer Murdoch on the bridge immediately sprang into action. He sharply ordered starboard. This meant the ship was turning to the right. At the same time, he reversed the engines. The ship would slow down and pass the iceberg. But there was a problem. The Titanic was too big. Its maneuverability was limited. It couldn't make sudden turns. Seconds passed. The ship slowly began to turn. But was it enough? Lookouts watched from above. The iceberg was terrifyingly close. The bow of the ship was trying to avoid the iceberg. It almost succeeded. But at that very moment, the side of the ship brushed against the underwater part of the iceberg. There was a slight jolt. Some passengers didn't even notice. Some felt a slight tremor. First-class passengers went up to the deck. They looked around curiously. Pieces of the iceberg had fallen onto the deck. Some passengers started playing with these pieces. They were laughing like snowballs. They didn't think anything was wrong. But the situation was different on the lower decks of the ship. Water started to come into the iron workshops. The workers were surprised. Where was the water coming from? They quickly went upstairs. In the boiler room, there were enormous boilers. It was producing hot steam. The stokers were adding coal. Suddenly, water gushed from the base of the wall. Cold seawater mixed with the hot boilers. There were steam explosions. The stokers fled in panic. The doors closed. Automatic watertight doors. Captain Smith rushed to the bridge. "What happened?" he asked. Murdoch explained. "We hit an iceberg, sir. I reversed the engines, but we couldn't escape." Captain Smith requested the ship's damage report. The ship's engineer, Thomas Andrews, immediately began the inspections. He went down to the lower decks. He checked compartment by compartment. The sight was terrifying. 6 compartments were taking on water. 6. Do you remember? Even if only 4 compartments took on water, the ship wouldn't sink. But 6 compartments was too many. Andrews did the calculations. He looked up. He looked at the captain. "The ship is going to sink," he said. "How much time do we have?" Captain Smith asked. Andrews replied, 1, maybe 2 hours. Not much. Captain Smith was shocked but didn't panic. He acted immediately. First, he went to the radio room. He gave orders to Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. "Send a CQD. Request help. Report our position." CD was the emergency distress signal of the time. It would later be changed to SOS. The operators began sending the messages. "The Titanic is sinking. Immediate help is needed." Which ship was the closest? The Carpathia was about 90 kilometers away. Even if it came, it would take 4 hours. Too long. The California was only 20 kilometers away, but its radio was off. It couldn't receive the message. The Titanic's crew could see the California. The ship's lights were shining in the distance. They started firing rocket flares, white rockets, an emergency signal. But the California ship saw the rockets, but didn't understand. The night watchman thought maybe they were celebrating. Because the radio was off, they couldn't receive the message. They just watched. They did nothing. There was no panic on the Titanic yet, because most of the passengers didn't know the seriousness of the situation. Captain Smith gave orders to the crew. "Distribute life jackets. Prepare the lifeboats. But there's no need to panic. Stay calm." The crew went door to door, giving life jackets to the passengers. "It's just a precaution. Please come up to deck," he said. Some passengers said, "Nonsense, the ship won't sink." But they still went up to deck without getting cold. Around 12:20 after midnight, the first lifeboat was ready. The officers tried to get people into the lifeboats. But there was a problem. The lifeboats were insufficient, a capacity of 1,000 to 1,120 people. But there were 2,200 people on board. A simple calculation. 1,000 people were to remain on the ship. They were to die. The captain's order was clear. First Officer Murdoch and Second Officer Lightoller directed the lifeboat operation, prioritizing women and children. However, They interpreted it differently. Murdoch accepted the men as well, if the women and children boarded. Lightoller, on the other hand, only took the women and children, turning the men away. This confusion affected the number of people rescued. The first lifeboat was lowered at 7:12 and 45 seconds p.m. Its capacity was 65 people, but only 28 disembarked. Why? Because people didn't want to leave the ship. They trusted the ship. Also, the weather was very cold. Sitting in the lifeboat seemed dangerous. They said the ship was safer. The crew tried to persuade them, but most hesitated. The second lifeboat was lowered at 5:12 and 55 seconds p.m. There were 40 people. Again, not enough. The third lifeboat had 40 people. The fourth lifeboat was lowered at 1:40 a.m. Only 12 people. 12. It was a lifeboat for 40 people. Why? Because Sir Cosmo Daff Gordon and his wife, Lady Lukill, had specifically requested it. The crew treated the wealthy passengers with special care. The lifeboat arrived almost empty. This would cause controversy. Around 1 o'clock, the passengers began to understand the seriousness of the situation. The ship was visibly listing. Its bow was sinking into the water. The band came up on deck. They started playing calming melodies, songs like "Nearer, My God, Today." The music calmed people. Some cried, some prayed. Some waited silently. Dramatic scenes unfolded among the first-class passengers. Isidore and Ida Strauss refused to board the lifeboat. Ida didn't leave her husband. "I will be where you are," she said. They both remained on the ship. Together they lost their lives. Benjamin Guggenheim took off his life jacket. He put on his best clothes. "If I'm going to sink, I'll sink like a gentleman," he said. John Jacob Astor put his pregnant wife in a lifeboat. He stayed on the ship. He said goodbye to his wife. "I'll see you in New York," he said. But he didn't. He lost his life. Second-class passengers were in a worse situation. They were prevented from going up to the deck because first-class passengers were put into lifeboats first. The doors were kept closed. Some second-class passengers forced the doors open. Some managed to get to the upper deck. Others were trapped on the lower decks. Third-class passengers were in the worst situation. They remained on the lower decks. No one told them what was happening. The stairs and doors were closed. Class distinction became a deadly difference. Some third-class passengers got lost. They couldn't find their way in the dark corridors. Some broke down the doors to get to the upper deck, but it was already too late. The lifeboats were full. Around 2 o'clock, the situation was very bad. The ship was almost vertical. People were slipping and falling into the water. Screams rose. The band was still playing. Until the very end. Some musicians dropped their instruments. Some played to the end. They all lost their lives. Thomas Andrews, the ship's engineer, spent his last moments alone. He was looking at a painting in the first-class lounge. He was lost in thought. Someone offered him a lifeboat. He refused. "I'm going to sing with my ship," he said. Captain Smith also remained on the bridge. He spent his last moments with his ship. At 2:15, the ship's lights went out. Darkness fell. At 2:20, the stern of the ship completely rose. It stood vertically. It remained like that for a few seconds. Then, with a terrible sound, the ship split in two. The front part was already underwater. The rear part fell into the water again. It floated for a few seconds. Then it too sank. There were 1,500 people in the sea. The water was -2 degrees Celsius. Life jackets allowed them to float, but the cold was unbearable. The human body couldn't withstand this temperature for more than 15 minutes. Screams rose. "Help, please." But the lifeboats were waiting in the distance. Why didn't they return? Because the officers feared that panicked people would attack the lifeboats. They thought the lifeboats would sink. Only a few lifeboats returned. They rescued a few more people, but most remained far away. After half an hour, the screams subsided. Silence fell. The cold took their toll. Hundreds of corpses floated in the sea. The lifeboats waited until morning. They were in the dark. They were cold. They were terrified. Some were crying. Some were praying. Some were waiting silently. Around 4 a.m., the Carpathia arrived. Captain Arthur Rostron was coming at full speed. He had received the Titanic's call. He had immediately changed course. It had taken 4 hours, but he arrived. On the horizon, the people in the lifeboats saw lights. They were hopeful. They shouted, "We've been rescued." The Carpathia approached the lifeboats. Ropes were thrown. People were pulled up. Some were very weak. Some were wounded. Some were yellow from hypothermia. The crew gave them supplies. They gave them hot soup. The passengers were shocked. They were crying. The Titanic sank. 1,500 people lost their lives. Only 715 people were rescued. The Carpathian transported the rescued passengers to New York. It arrived at New York Harbor on the evening of April 18th. Thousands of people were waiting at the harbor. Families were searching for their loved ones. Journalists were taking photographs. Survivors disembarked from the ship. Some reunited with their families. Some couldn't find anyone. They were left alone. The news spread throughout the world. The Titanic sank. The ship, considered unsinkable, sank on its maiden voyage. Shockwaves spread. Newspapers carried the headline, "The Titanic Disaster." 1,500 people died. People were shocked. How could it be? How did the most advanced technology, the safest ship, sink? Investigations began. Investigations in America, investigations in England. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed. Surviving passengers, crew, experts. Everyone gave statements. Questions were asked. Answers were sought. The culprits were sought. The first question was, why wasn't the speed reduced? There were iceberg warnings. Warnings came from 6 different ships. Why weren't they heeded? Captain Smith was blamed. But Captain Smith had passed away. He couldn't defend himself. The White Star Line Company was blamed. They said, "You exerted competitive pressure. You wanted speed." The company refused. "No, the captain made his own decision," he said. The second question was, why weren't there enough lifeboats? The ship was carrying 2,200 people, but there were only lifeboats for 1120. Why? The company said they were complying with the laws. According to the laws of the time, there were enough, but the investigators didn't accept that. The laws were old. You knew that. Why didn't you put more lifeboats? The company said, the deck would have been crowded. It was an illogical defense. The third question was, why didn't the California ship help? It was only 20 kilometers away. It saw the rockets. Why didn't it come? Captain Stanley Lord of the California was questioned. He defended himself. We didn't understand that the rockets were an emergency. The radio was off. We had no information. The investigators were not satisfied. You saw the rockets. You should have acted. Lord was accused. His career ended. The fourth question was, why were some lifeboats half empty? They lowered lifeboats designed for 65 people with only 12 people on board. Why? The officers were questioned. People didn't want to get on. They said they pressured them, but they were afraid. But the truth was more complex. There was class segregation. First-class passengers were taken first. Third-class passengers were kept on the lower decks. This led to controversy. Investigations lasted several weeks. The report was published. The findings were revealed. The Titanic disaster was a combination of human error, design flaws, and corporate negligence. Captain Smith made the wrong decision regarding speed. The White Star Line deployed insufficient lifeboats. The Californian did not provide assistance. Radio operators ignored warnings. Multiple errors combined to create the disaster. Changes were made after the investigations. International maritime laws were changed. Every ship was required to carry enough lifeboats at full capacity. Radio systems had to be operational 24 hours a day. Iceberg areas were monitored more carefully. An international ice patrol was established. Ships were required to conduct safety exercises. The Titanic disaster fundamentally changed maritime safety. But the truly interesting part began after the sinking. The Titanic lay at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean at a depth of 3,800 meters. For years, no one could find it. Many exploration attempts were made but failed because the ocean floor was dark and cold. The pressure was very high. The technology was inadequate. In 1985, an oceanographer named Robert Ballhard decided to find the Titanic. The American Navy supported him. They used advanced underwater robots. They conducted final scans. They searched for months. They found nothing. They were disappointed but did not give up. At 1:30 a.m. on a September day, the robot's camera spotted something. Metal fragments. They looked closer. A boiler. They had found the Titanic's boilers. Ballard shouted excitedly, "We found the Titanic!" The world was shocked. 73 years later, the Titanic had been found. Ballard and his team examined the wreck. The ship was split in two. The front section remained intact 600 meters away. The rear section was in ruins. There were pieces of wreckage scattered around. Piles of coal, furniture, plates, shoes, human belongings, but no bodies. 73 years had passed. The ocean floor had decayed everything. In 1987, another team descended to the wreck. They began to retrieve the artifacts. Plates, watches, jewelry, coins, suitcases. Thousands of items were recovered. They were displayed in museums, sold. This sparked debate. Some said these items belonged to the deceased and should not be retrieved. Music, others said no. History should be preserved and displayed in museums. The items recovered from the wreck told the story of the Titanic's final moments. The hands of a clock had stopped at 225, precisely at the moment the ship sank. Letters were found in a suitcase. A passenger had written to his family, "We'll meet in New York. I love you very much." But they never met. A pair of shoes lay side by side. Their owner had passed away that night. The shoes remained there for years. The Titanic wreck is decaying over time. Bacteria that eat away at the iron are consuming the ship. Experts predict that the Titanic will completely collapse within 2030. Only a pile of metal will remain. The historical artifact will be lost. That's why intensive studies have been conducted in recent years. 3D scans have been done. Every detail has been recorded so that future generations can at least see it digitally. The Titanic's legacy is not just the wreck. The disaster itself changed society. Class distinctions were questioned. Why were first-class passengers rescued while third-class passengers perished? Why did the wealthy board the lifeboats first? Why were the poor trapped in the lower decks? These questions raised the issue of social justice. The rule of women and children first was debated. While ethical, was this rule truly fair? Were men's lives worth less? Some men made sacrifices to save their families. Some women didn't leave their husbands, like Isidore and Ida Strauss. These stories demonstrated love and loyalty. The band played to the very end. None of them survived, but they gave people morale. They helped them spend their final moments peacefully. This sacrifice was never forgotten. The musicians were remembered as heroes. Captain Smith sank with his ship Some blamed him. He should have slowed down. He should have changed course. Others defended him. He was an experienced captain. The truth probably lay somewhere between the two. He made mistakes, but he fulfilled his duty to the end. More than 100 years have passed since the Titanic disaster, but it's still talked about. Films have been made, books written, documentaries filmed. Why? Because the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of humanity's pride, arrogance, and overconfidence in technology. They said it was unsinkable. It sank. They said it was the safest. 1,500 people died. This taught humanity a lesson in humility. Modern society is still learning from the Titanic. Safety should never be compromised. Economics is not more important than human life. Class divisions can be deadly. Heeding the warnings is vital. They are simple lessons, but they must not be forgotten. Today, the Titanic's name is legendary. It is frequently mentioned in popular culture. The expression, "It sank like the Titanic," describes great failures. The expression, "the tip of the iceberg," means seeing only a small part of the problem. The Titanic has even entered our language. There are names remembered among the Titanic's passengers. Molly Brown was known as Molly the Unsinkable because she led the lifeboat, motivated the crew, and made them row. After being rescued, she also helped the other survivors. She was a strong and courageous woman. Benjamin Guggenheim spent his final moments nobly. He took off his life jacket, put on a tuxedo, drank with his friends, and listened to music. "If I'm going to die, I'll die like a gentleman," he said, and so it was. Thomas Andrews, the naval engineer, spent his final moments alone. The ship he designed was sinking. He blamed himself. "I could have done more," he thought, but it was too late. He sank with his ship. There were heroes among the Titanic's crew. Some officers performed their duties until the very end. Some stokers kept the boilers running. Some waiters served the passengers so the lights would stay on. They all did their jobs to keep them calm. Most perished. Radio operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bright sent out distress calls until the very end. Phillips died. Bright survived, but his hands were frostbitten. He underwent treatment for weeks. He never forgot the Titanic for the rest of his life. The Titanic disaster has also been the subject of many conspiracy theories. Some claimed it was deliberately sunk. They said it was insurance fraud, but there was no evidence. Some put forward the theory of a ship swapping. They said it wasn't the Titanic, but its sister ship, the Olympic, that sank. But that was also absurd. The ships had different serial numbers. The wreck had Titanic written on it. Some believed it was cursed. He said the ship lived its fate. It was going to sink anyway. It was mystical belief. It wasn't scientific. The truth is, the Titanic sank because mistakes were made. Human errors, design flaws, bad decisions. Not a curse or anything like that. As the years passed, the Titanic survivors grew old. They passed away one by one. The last survivor, Milvin A. Dudin, died in 2009. He was 97 years old. He was only 2 months old when the Titanic sank. He didn't remember his memories, but he knew the story. He participated in Titanic events throughout his life. He gave interviews. He kept the story alive. Now there are no survivors, but the story lives on. The objects displayed in museums tell the story. Documentaries convey the facts. Films reflect the emotions. The Titanic will not be forgotten. James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic affected the world. It told a romantic story. Jack and Rose, two people from different classes, met on the ship. They fell in love, but disaster struck. Jack lost his life. Rose survived. It was a fictional story, but it contained real emotions. The film won 11 Oscars. Millions watched it. It brought Titanic back into the spotlight. The sinking of the Titanic was not just a tragedy. It was also a turning point in human history. It demonstrated the dangers of blindly trusting technology. It revealed the deadly consequences of social injustice. It offered examples of courage and sacrifice, and most importantly, it taught us that nothing is unsinkable. Today, safety is paramount in sea voyages. Every ship has enough lifeboats. Radio systems operate 24 hours a day. Ice patrol systems are in place. Emergency drills are conducted regularly. The legacy of the Titanic lives on in these safety measures. Lessons were learned from a disaster. Thousands of lives were saved. The story of the Titanic must not be forgotten. It must be remembered so that it is not repeated. Every generation must learn this story. Mistakes must not be repeated. Lives must be protected. Now your eyes are probably starting to close. Perhaps you've even drifted off. This long journey is nearing its end. The story of the Titanic is sad but instructive. 1,500 people lost their lives, but their stories will live on forever. The Titanic still lies 3,800 meters deep at the bottom of the sea, silently decaying in the darkness. One day it will completely disappear, but the memories will not fade, because humanity will never forget the Titanic. Tonight we explored the mysterious secrets of the Titanic. We saw its design flaws. We experienced the details of its final night. We learned about the changes that occurred after the disaster. And most importantly, we observed the resilience and weakness of humanity together. If you've listened this far, thank you. My aim was to both pique your curiosity and offer a relaxing journey. I hope I succeeded. I hope this story taught you something and helped you sleep peacefully. The Titanic reminds us of this. Life is fragile. It can change at any moment. Therefore, we must cherish every moment. We must value our loved ones and never be arrogant, because nature is stronger than technology. No matter how advanced humanity becomes, it remains small in the face of nature. Like the musicians on the Titanic, we must fulfill our duty to the very end. Like Isidore and Ida Strauss, we must remain faithful to those we love. Like Molly Brown, we must be strong in the face of adversity. And like Captain Smith, we must fulfill our responsibilities. When you close your eyes, perhaps you will imagine the Titanic, the giant ship, its magnificent hulls, its elegant passengers. Perhaps you will see the iceberg. Perhaps you will contemplate the final moments as it silently approaches in the darkness. The screams, the music, the cold water. But in the end, you will find peace. Because this story, though painful, marks the end of an era. Remember, the Titanic sank, but humanity continued. Lessons were learned from mistakes. Lives were saved. Progress was made. This is the power of hope. Humanity can rise again when it falls. It can learn when it suffers. It can rebuild when it loses. Now take a deep breath. Relax. Close your eyes. The story of the Titanic ends here, but your story continues. Tomorrow will be a new day. It will bring new hopes, new opportunities. Tonight, perhaps in your dreams you will walk on the decks of that magnificent ship. Perhaps you will gaze at the stars. Perhaps you will find peace. It's all over now. It's just time to rest. Good night, sweet dreams, and peaceful sleep.